Welcome, everyone, to the last week of Agenda 2025, the conference that we've been running at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity about the inclusive, small L liberal agenda of equal opportunity that can unite Americans for the president who's inaugurated in 2025. And you may think, why are we talking about 2025 when we have a new president coming in 2021? And the answer is it takes 4 years to really build an agenda that can encompass these principles and combine them in a new way that a new president can embody. And today, we're going to talk about an issue that's been very much in the news this year and in the last several years, but with perhaps a twist that not everyone is familiar with. And that is to say, we're going to talk about criminal justice reform and policing reform and Black Lives Matter from the perspective of three prominent libertarians who've been at the forefront of the movement to establish equal justice. And what's particularly interesting about this concept is that we think of Black Lives Matter as sort of a left-wing thing or a progressive thing or something we associate with Democrats. And there are plenty of libertarians who would contest that, who say, hey, I'm just as skeptical of big government when it comes to prosecutors and police and the way police departments act as I am about school districts or the IRS. But that isn't a universally held position. In the conservative world, as many of you know, there's this tension between the libertarians who support criminal justice reform and those who believe that such efforts are, as one scholar has put it, a war on cops. With that introduction, we're gonna take the conversation to our friends here, Clay Spence of the Cicero Institute, which is a think tank that was headquartered in San Francisco, moving to Austin in the next several months, founded by Joe Lonsdale. Vikrant Reddy of the Charles Koch Institute, who's been a guy who has seen it all, really lived in Austin, was part of the Texas reforms under Governor Rick Perry that then became the basis of much of the First Step Act, the criminal justice reform bill that passed with bipartisan majorities and was signed into law by President Trump. And Jonathan Blanks of FREOPP, who spent 12 years at the Cato Institute before joining us about a year ago. So welcome to all of you. Just as a reminder, if you have a question for our panelists, we'll get to your questions as soon as possible. Just tweet at #Agenda2025 or click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. With that, Vikrant, let me start with you because you're the guy who has, because of your role in the ecosystem, you've seen a lot of the work that so many libertarians and non-libertarians have done in this area. Tell us a little bit about the history of how libertarians got involved in criminal justice reform and where we are today.
Oh gosh, well, if you want to go really, really far back, to John Locke or however far back, you'd have to say there's something really deep in the libertarian spirit and the libertarian soul that gets bothered when you see people incarcerated. People living in cages like they're animals is just disturbing at some libertarian gut level. And it is, at the end of the day, an exercise of state power against individuals. So at a just very basic philosophical level, you sort of understand why libertarians would always be concerned about criminal justice and incarceration in any society. But you're asking a more narrow and specific question about recent decades. And in recent decades, you had a situation where the United States suffered from very high crime rates. They were going up and up throughout the very late 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. That really happened, by the way. When our progressive friends tell us, oh, there was a bit of a hysteria behind that, don't believe that. Crime really did go up and it really was a problem. But then you developed a counter problem, which was that the solution to many people was to get, quote unquote, tough on crime. That meant increasing sentences dramatically, making them more harsh, finding ways to abolish parole, criminalizing more things, just broadening the nets where people get scooped into the criminal justice system. That really set off the libertarian spidey sense, right? They started asking, to what degree is this an overuse of state power? To what extent has the pendulum simply swung too far? Even if you really did need to address the crime epidemic with a little bit more incarceration, has it simply gone too far at this point? And I think that's what got libertarians, and even to some extent recently, a lot of conservatives who wouldn't call themselves libertarians interested in this issue.
And we should note that our neighbors here in Austin at the Texas Public Policy Foundation have been among the forefront of this. You were actually there as well, Vikrant, if I recall correctly, at TBPF.
Yeah, it's work I'm very
1 and 2.
proud of. We could get into it a little bit if you want, but the broad outline is simply that Texas sort of stood up and said, we are the ultimate tough on crime state. We have the credibility to actually scale back very high levels of incarceration in the state, to invest more in things like better parole and probation. They did it under Rick Perry, who, is just not a governor that anybody would ever accuse of being soft on crime. And it worked. Texas right now is the lowest crime rate it's enjoyed since 1967, and it's continued to see incarceration rates decline. And so it's kind of emerged as a bit of a model for other red states.
Jonathan, let's bring you in here. I mean, you've been involved in this line of work for over a decade now. There has been this evolution, but it's been an evolution in terms of Republican or libertarian or center right or conservative interest in this question that has happened in fits or starts. Tell us about that work of getting more people interested in this, because the paradigm used to be that it was the liberal left that was soft, quote unquote, soft on crime, wanting to engage in these topics, and it was the tough on crime conservatives. There was the 1994 crime bill. I believe it was 94, maybe it was 93. The Clinton signed in to show that he was a different kind of Democrat, which also Joe Biden was party to in the Senate. And now we're in this paradigm where things seem to have shifted a lot. Tell us about that and where things stand now in terms of the intra-conservative, intra-liberty movement debate about criminal justice reform.
Yeah, so when I first came to DC and got into the libertarian movement, the focus seemed to be mostly on the war on drugs. It was the war on drugs nonstop, 24/7. Trying to pull the left, trying to pull the liberals into that. We're like, no, really, what we're doing with the war on drugs is wrong. We're locking people up for, personal choices that they're making. They're not hurting anyone else, and obviously you can have debates around that. But yeah, I mean, as recently as 2016, President-elect Biden was touting the 1994 crime bill as the Biden crime bill. I mean, this was something that the Democrats did not run away from. They've changed their ideas over time, but this is something that, was a bipartisan effort, and this was something that people were really behind. So, but in the libertarian mold, I think it's gotten more into, as we're learning more about evidence-based practices and like the impacts of incarceration, it's not just the drug war, but it is a necessary but insufficient solution to some of these problems. But the fighting then within the libertarian movement is, if you think about sort of your hardcore anarchist libertarians, not so much in the think tank world, but they exist. They're like the police abolitionists that are out on the streets today, right? But of a different sort of mold. Whereas there's also what is the actual purpose of the state? What is the legitimate purpose of the state? And the police and criminal justice is one of the things that libertarians say, oh no, this is actually something that the state needs to do. And so there's this tension between what it is that libertarians like, well, we want the freedom to do things, but at the same time, we're not going to say that, you have to get rid of the police, because that is one of the few things that we actually think that the state should do. And so it's this tension between what it is we're asking the police to do and what the best interest for the society is, and trying to balance the human freedoms that we all enjoy and fight for.
Clay, to you've been doing a lot of work at the state level trying to reform a bunch of state-based laws, and you've been working with both kinds. You've been working with Republican states, you've been working with Democratic states. Normally, when you think about, say, someone who's more Republican-leaning working with a Democrat, if it's an issue that's historically a Democratic issue, people might welcome that. What's been your experience when you do work in California, where you live, on criminal justice reform? How has that gone for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe before I answer that, I'll just speak to the philosophical framing here and what libertarianism means in criminal justice. I guess my take here is that there are two impulses from the libertarian perspective, and I would somewhat resist the notion that I'm a hardline libertarian and view myself more as a pragmatist. But I think on the one hand, as Vikrant and Jonathan said, there is a concern with a limitation on government power because police force is government power at its most coercive. It is the thing that you cannot do without. There's the famous Nozick phrase, the night watchman state. And the view is that police power is the last thing that you can give up without descending into total anarchy. And in order to maintain a system of laws and a social order in which freedom is preserved for everyone, you do need police power. And so I think, however, the implementation of government power and police force always comes with tyrannical consequences. I think that's inevitable. And so the libertarian impulse is, how do we check these insofar as possible, but also make sure that the police have the ability to keep society in order and preserve maximal freedom for everyone else in society. I think another perspective is sort of, I would describe it as like a libertarian retributivist view on crime and punishment, and sort of the Kantian line of thinking about what does it mean to universalize a criminal's will, which is to inflict injury and deny the freedom of others. And so I think in order to preserve freedom in society and to insist on the value of freedom, you also have to believe in punishment intrinsically. So it's not merely about preserving security, but it's about universalizing and turning the criminal's will upon the criminal too. So those are sort of philosophical bases from which I come at this. I went in California last year and attempted to pass a parole reform in California. And the idea, I think, was somewhat distant from the philosophical discussion we've been having. But the idea is that recidivism rates are too high in the United States, and they hover around 70% nationally, and they're pretty bad at the state level. And there are things that we can do to diminish recidivism rates or to rehabilitate people more effectively. I went in and was working in California, obviously, which is dominated by left-wing sorts of interest groups and advocacy organizations. And the short of it is that I found it very difficult to accomplish reform in a state like this. And I think, I found it difficult, I think in part because of sort of partisanship. And I think there was certainly reluctance to embrace a reform group that didn't have a formerly incarcerated person of color as the primary spokesperson for the group. And I think that is now the state of affairs in California for the most part. I faced some resistance, but I think most of the resistance was actually just sort of political bickering from these other groups. Probably best not to name names, but the short of it is we were pushing a criminal justice reform that would have rewarded parole departments for reducing return to incarceration rates. Very simple idea. The question is, why don't we do this? This actually builds on kind of the justice reinvestment savings work that was originally pioneered by the Soros Foundation, among others. So it's not a particularly partisan view. But we went in to try to do this, and the idea is you can take savings from prisons or from averted returns to incarceration and apply those towards doing rehabilitation in probation and parole departments. There's kind of a long track record of doing this in probation and parole departments across the country. I garnered consensus from each of the other 25 groups in the state that this was the appropriate thing to do, but then ran into a lot of difficulty when it actually came down to trying to pass the law. And I'm not sure if now it's the appropriate place to talk about it, but we'd be happy to describe kind of some of the tactical difficulties and what it means to try to get a criminal justice reform done. The ways in which I think the political necessities of achieving wins as a nonprofit distort the ultimate objective, even where both the left and the right agree on the aim, as they did in this case. And I think, so I'm happy to talk about that a bit further if you'd like, but that was sort of what I discovered. Partisanship fell away and real politics took the floor.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about Democrat versus Republican. It was various nonprofit groups who, whether for wanting to take credit or not to put words in your mouth, but to wanting to take credit or for other reasons, wanted to, there was a kind of a turf battle, we might say. Is that the right way to think about it?
Sure. I think that's the right way to think about it. And I think at this point in time, so as Vikrant said, I think the left and the right have kind of converged now. There was sort of an earlier convergence as crime rates spiked, I think, and in the 90s, you saw a lot of convergence on the sort of law and order view of criminal justice. Today, it's something very different, where you have this pretty heterodox set of groups with different philosophical viewpoints coming together around the idea of criminal justice reform. On the right, you have kind of Christian conservatives interested in the idea of redemption and interested in rehabilitation programs as a way to help people get back on their feet and start new lives in society. And then on the left, you have kind of a coalition of reformers who fundamentally, I think, believe in the new Jim Crow idea, or the idea that the criminal justice system is merely an extension of slavery. There's nothing redeeming about it. There's no utility to the system. And at the most extreme endorses, sort of the prison abolitionist viewpoint or the defund the police viewpoint. For those of you who think these are sort of absurd views, just know that they have they carry a ton of weight in the actual reformer community. And if you're dealing with sort of left-wing nonprofits at the state level, these are the views that their representatives hold. So I do think there's a lot of consensus right now. And that's good. And so you sometimes find strange bedfellow situations with coalitions of criminal justice reformers on both sides of the aisle. Vikrant can certainly speak to this with the First Step Act and other reforms that he's worked on. But that was what I found in California. I was working with groups whose political philosophies were not aligned with my own, but we shared the view that it was possible to improve the criminal justice system, which is just tragically broken and corrupt. And fix it in a way that not only decreases crime, which is something that conservatives care about, but helps formerly incarcerated people get back on their feet. And the basis for this, I should mention, I guess, is that in California, over the last 10 years, they implemented this program in probation. And this kind of rewards for reducing returns to incarceration has averted about 100,000 people from returning to prison in California and saved the state $1 billion independently of that. So hugely successful reform, should happen in every probation and parole department in the country. We're talking about a population of 4.5 million people nationally. So it's huge. It's far greater than the actual incarcerated population. What I found, though, was that ultimately we wound up championing two different bills. On the one hand, the sort of left of center reformer groups championed a bill that would have cut the length of parole in California from 3 years to 6 months for almost everyone on parole. So a fairly drastic measure to decrease just parole as an institution, with an eye towards ultimately eliminating this institution, which they've tried to push in other states. And then on my part, pushing a reform that took the resources that were available with parole as an institution, didn't try to rock the boat too much, didn't try to completely overturn parole, but instead tried to turn parole into an institution that could rehabilitate effectively on the grounds that has been done effectively elsewhere. And ultimately, we wound up championing these two different bills, two separate ideas. These ideas are not necessarily in context. I mean, I think you can do kind of a pay for performance program even with a smaller parole unit or shorter terms for people on parole. But at the end of the day, we actually wound up clashing with each other. And there was sort of sabotage on the part of these other groups to dismantle the reform that we were pushing in order that they could get the moderate Democrats in California to champion their reform. And so it wound up being a purely political calculation. Yeah, I think it's probably best not to name names, and we may need to work with some of these groups again next year. I've spoken with them after the fact, and they agreed that this is the way that things went down, which I found totally shocking. But that was my experience. It was an experience of essentially confronting politics at its worst, rather than confronting partisanship or conflicting philosophical viewpoints, because I think in the end, those things don't make a difference. Don't make a difference for the kind of vast category of criminal justice reforms that we can all believe in and work on.
Interesting. So the picture that you're all painting here is there's, in a sense, three different categories of people in this debate. There's the what I think Jonathan described, or maybe it was you, Clay, as the abolitionists, shall we say, and then there's the pragmatic reformers who say, hey, we are over incarcerating, we're over policing, and there are ways to reform that still keep people safe, but that minimize the imposition that policing and incarceration impose. And then there's maybe what we might call the status quo anti, or the more the tough on crime. Let's focus on making sure the police can do their job. Conservatives. We have actually, I don't know if it's a question or a comment from former Governor George Allen, who says, which state has the lowest recidivist rate and a very low violent crime rate? The answer is Virginia, with truth in sentencing. Vikrant, you're the Virginia resident here. Do you have any thoughts on the Gov's point?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I grew up in Dallas, so I'm answering this question under duress because I know that Mr. Allen's associated with the Washington football team. We grew up rooting against him. But that aside, what I will say is I think that the governor's question rests on a very faulty premise. He is assuming, and first of all, I should say, I'm not sure about Virginia having the lowest recidivism rate in the country. But setting that aside, I want to talk about the broader premise underneath this question. He seems to think that as long as you're tough enough, then somebody on the brink of committing a crime is going to do a rational calculation and say, well, do I really want to suffer these consequences? No, I'd better not commit this crime. The thing is, if you've ever met people who are engaged in criminal behavior, they are not rational actors, not even slightly. They are extremely impulsive people. They do things on a whim. And you can't do this kind of math problem in your head where you say, well, if we just make the penalty twice as harsh, then perhaps we'll get twice the deterrent effect and we'll have half as much of this sort of crime being committed. I mean, that kind of arithmetic just simply doesn't work. So obviously I believe in punishment, and obviously I believe that, some level of incarceration is necessary in a society. But what I would push back against is this idea that I think underlies the governor's statement that as long as you get harder, you'll get more deterrence. It doesn't quite work that way.
Can you explain, just for the audience that may not be familiar, the truth in sentencing policy that he's described there? What did that policy do in Virginia? Yeah,
I'll describe it, and I think I can describe it fairly and help communicate why so many people were enthusiastic about it and why it makes a certain amount of sense. We have these situations where people go before a judge and say they get sentenced to 5 years in prison. But then they end up getting out in 4 years because of good behavior or whatever it is that you hear about in the news. And people get really angry. They see this kind of thing and they say, well, gosh, this person committed this crime. The judge said 5 years. Why don't they serve the 5 years? 5 means 5. Why are they getting out in 4 and 3.5? This doesn't make any sense to me. And you can understand why people would feel that way. So there was a movement towards something called truth in sentencing, which meant that if the judge says 5, 5 means 5. You don't get to earn time off of your sentence in all of these various ways. And several states passed laws like this. Virginia was one of the most prominent. Here's the problem with that. When you let somebody out of prison, you cannot simply hand them a $20 bill and a bus pass and say, all right, go start your life again. It's too difficult. There has to be some kind of a graduated period where you help ease them back into the system. You get them everything they need. Some of that stuff is really obvious. You get them, the right job leads and things like that. You help them learn how to interview. Some of these things, you may not even think about, but they're incredibly important. You get somebody a driver's license. They need to show identification whenever they walk into the job interview. They need help knowing how to do these things because over the course of however many years they've been behind bars, technology has probably changed dramatically. These things require some kind of an ease-in period. And that's a big part of why people began to push back against some of these truth in sentencing laws, or in some states, they didn't do it at all. They said, look, you've got to preserve some amount of time. You've got to incentivize people to earn time off their sentence, to do the right programs, drug treatment, mental health counseling, whatever it may be. It's an incentive for them to earn time off their sentence, and then have a period where there's a kind of structured supervisory period where they can re-enter society. And that makes everybody safer because I actually happen to know this statistic in the state of Virginia. 98% of the people behind bars in Virginia will eventually come out from behind bars, and they will live next door to me and to Governor Allen. We want them to be successful because we don't want them to be hurting us again.
Yeah, you're raising a really interesting point that if we may be outside the scope of this conversation, maybe we'll get to it, which is this point about reentry, right? If you have a conviction on your record, it's obviously so hard to get a job in most places. Here in Austin, we recently passed one of those ban the box provisions where you're not allowed to ask applicants for their criminal history, which appears to have both upsides and downsides if some of the academic research is to be believed on the subject. But before we get to that, we have another question here from Ingrid Skopp, who says, okay, let me go to Governor Allen first, because he just comes in with a follow-up. He says they were getting released in 1/5 of the sentence. I'll just read. I'll read the comment, and then if you want to respond, go ahead. They were getting released in I think it's 1/5 of the sentence. Even Democratic Governor McAuliffe touted Virginia's lowest recidivism rate. There is rehabilitation. Felons can earn 15% credit for GED, etc., not 75% off. So he's arguing that there are some of those re-entry provisions in Virginia law.
Yeah, I have no doubt that those, some kinds of these provisions exist, but I think the broader point, the idea that truth in sentencing as kind of a flat policy idea makes sense. It simply doesn't work because it doesn't give people incentives to do the kinds of things we want them to do while they're behind bars, and it also denies them this kind of opportunity to re-enter society in a safe and secure way.
Great. So let's go to the question from Ingrid. One area that libertarians love to talk about is decriminalizing drug use, not just libertarians. This is also part of criminal justice reform, the idea that if we decriminalize marijuana use and perhaps other drugs, this would just itself reduce the incarceration rate in a way that would still preserve public safety. And Ingrid asks, can you comment on the correlation between drug use and crime, especially in relation to states like Oregon decriminalizing drug use? And obviously there have been a lot of ballot initiatives all over the country. Do any of you have thoughts on that? Have we seen any statistics that suggest that decriminalization of drugs are leading to upticks in crime or other problems?
Not that I've seen. I actually have seen there are some second order effects that I don't think people were expecting. I mean, definitely proponents of these decriminalization, legalization bills were like, actually it will make it harder for kids to use. And that seems to be bearing out pretty much wherever like marijuana has been legalized, like teen use drops. And so that's obviously a good thing. We haven't seen a large spike in crime anywhere, or if it is, it doesn't seem to be necessarily direct. There's no hard statistical link to it. And then on top of it, we've seen other things like because so much of my work involves policing, we've actually seen a dramatic reduction in pretextual traffic stops because cops look for drugs because they're on drug task forces or whatever. And those things those rates have gone down where states have legalized, and there hasn't been a crime spike, which means we have this aggressive policing that we've indirectly helped, that we've indirectly reduced, and we're not seeing an increase in crime. And I think that's a very good thing. That is not something that generally you hear when we talk about, trying to decriminalize or legalize drugs.
We have a question from about the Ferguson effect. So the Ferguson effect is this idea that if you get too tough on the police and hold them aggressively accountable for things that go wrong, and in some cases perhaps the things that police officers would argue are not their fault, then the police become risk averse, go on strike, as sometimes the phrase is called, or however it's described. The question goes, homicides climbed over 20% from 2014 to 2016 after Ferguson, and dropped during the first 3 years of Trump after the DOJ ended most of the consent decrees on local governments. This year, homicides increased by a lot in 14 of the largest 15 states post Minneapolis. Do any of you subscribe to this hypothesis? If not, what do you ascribe these large increases in crime? How do we think about the Ferguson effect?
I don't really support the theory at all. I think what statistics I've seen lead me to believe there's something close to a Freddie Gray effect, which is slightly different, because Ferguson is a suburban area. It doesn't have the sort of the foot traffic that you have in a major metropolitan area. So it just doesn't really fit that well. Whereas where you actually did have a pretty drastic pullback in what the Baltimore police did, but they also instituted martial law for a while there. I don't know if before the pandemic, it was the weirdest thing to see a baseball game played in front of an empty stadium because they were so afraid of their communities. There are so many different things that go into why crime goes up. We don't always know everything that goes involved, but the idea that policing in Ferguson, Missouri is going to affect the murder rate in Washington, D.C., it doesn't really work. There are 18,000 police agencies in this country, that they're not directly related. It's not the same. It's not that someone's thinking, you know, the cop shot Michael Brown, so I'm going to go out and shoot someone today. I mean, this doesn't really work. That's not how people's minds work, right? So we have to look at a bunch of other issues about trust in police, whether or not the police are doing the things that we ask them to do, like be visible in places without necessarily shaking them down for, say, stop and frisk or something along those lines. I can't tell you why, you know, the murder rate went up, but it has happened, and it isn't just because of de-escalating in policing. Washington, D.C. has seen high rates of murder the last 3 years, and the police are still pulling more guns off the street than pretty much any other major metropolitan area per capita, right? So it's not that the cops aren't being aggressive, and it's not the cops aren't out there doing it, and yet these things are still happening. So just saying, well, it's because President Trump or it's because the Ferguson effect, they're too simple of answers for a very complicated problem that happens in many different places at many different times at the same time.
Is it Roland Fryer who from Harvard who did the research recently on the Ferguson effect? Am I making that up? Didn't someone put out a study recently about this that suggested that there was some correlation?
I believe that was Fryer's work. Fryer's work has come under a lot of scrutiny recently for its methodological problems. I think, and again, I think if you're looking at something that, you know, is happening in one place and then having effect on crime rates in another, I don't buy it.
You know, Avik, I think I see it a little bit differently than Jonathan. I've read some research from a criminologist at the University of Missouri named Richard Rosenfeld, which suggests that there may be something to the Ferguson effect. I take Jonathan's point, you know, about how complex these phenomena tend to be and how different places are. But I do think that it's reasonable to assume that in the modern world of social media, certain kinds of things can travel like wildfire, and you could understand why police officers in a jurisdiction that's 1,000 miles away might say, gosh, there's a kind of national mood that's going to cause me to back off a little bit and how aggressive I might be in the way that I do my work. To me, that doesn't seem crazy to think that something like that might be happening. But I think that Jonathan and I might agree on a broader point, which is that really the big issue here is just doing what we can to preserve trust between police officers and their community. That's ultimately going to be the solution to all these kinds of problems. And I'll read stories from time to time about really kind of striking displays of how trust falls apart. So one that comes to mind is it concerns this awful police shooting that happened in Milwaukee. I feel so terrible that I can't remember the details of it right now because sadly there have just been so many that they all, you know, it's hard to remember each one. But there was an awful incident in Milwaukee, and they did a study that showed that in the aftermath of this incident, police calls to 911 dropped tremendously. And that was kind of striking because crime did not actually drop in Milwaukee at that point. It's just that people's trust and faith in the ability of the police and government to respond to crime declined. And that is a real tragedy. And those are the kinds of things that we want to avoid. That's why I think ultimately the solutions are going to be not calling for funding the police, but finding ways to bring the police into the solution and making them and communities work together more strongly.
Absolutely, I agree with that. I think one of the secrets to that is looking at evidence-based policing practices, which is a lot of times police-led, in like trying to figure out what policing strategies actually do work and do reduce crime and in ways that are respective of people's civil liberties. The work of Cynthia Lum and a lot of the other scholars out at George Mason and also out at Arizona State have shown that there are policing measures that we can use that police departments can employ that can actually, you know, reduce the number of violent crime in high crime areas and without, you know, shaking people down and harassing them, and particularly innocent people, you know, just going about their lives.
Clay, let's get you in here. You know, I thought Vikrant's you know, kind of closing point was really interesting, which is this issue of trust is so important, right? How do you know, if we really want to solve the problem, we have to come up with a system in which the community has that confidence that when they call the police will come, and also that there isn't an overreaction that creates the community mistrust, and vice versa. The police need to be able to trust the community so that they don't overreact to situations. That's obviously been a tough balance to strike. what have you observed in that regard? How do we rebuild that trust, or how do we build that trust back up where it's lacking?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Avik. So I guess before I answer that, I would say I strongly believe that policing is a deterrent to crime. No ifs, ands, or buts about it to answer the original question. Obviously, there are better and worse ways of doing policing, but I think the data, even from stop and frisk, was that it was wildly successful at dropping homicides. From over 2,000 a year in the early 1990s to around 300 today in New York City. Unquestionably racialized. I think all of those arguments are true. I think there are better ways to do policing. So one great example, I think, is the 90s. New York under Willie Bratton still saw a huge drop in crime, even after moving from the kind of stop and frisk policing policy to more of like a hot spot, or what sometimes unpopularly known as broken windows theory policing, was able to decrease crime after peeling back from kind of stop and frisk practices. But I think it's unquestionably true that policing deters crime. And I do think that across the country, there's declining trust in police as an institution, possibly rapidly declining trust, I think, in the wake of the protests earlier this summer. But a lot of this actually traces to kind of earlier attitudes. I mean, even in California, in the aftermath of Prop 47, which didn't decriminalize, but kind of reduced from felonies to misdemeanors, low-level crimes. So say theft under, I think it was $950. There was sort of a rash of that exact sort of crime. And people called the police initially. There was limited police response. I attribute that more to kind of top-down commands from the top of the police hierarchy in places like LA. But eventually people just stopped calling and trust was eroded. And those kinds of car break-ins are epidemic in California right now. And I think that is in part because of poor policing practices. And I think there's very justifiable distrust of police in places like that. I think there's a lot that we can do to strengthen trust in police departments. And I think one place that seems reasonable to me to start is police unions. And so in America, there are 700,000 plus police officers who are unionized, which is a little over 60% of all police. These are extremely powerful labor groups, and they often do things that are to the advantage of police departments, but not in the interest of the general public. And one of these things is that when an officer commits an act of brutality, they have access to all of the evidence that will be used in the trial well before, whereas the victim does not, and they have access to this evidence up to 72 hours before the internal investigation from the investigative division of the police department is launched. And there are a variety of other ways that the police unions just make it as hard as possible to discipline officers who've committed acts of brutality. So one of them is that disciplinary records are destroyed after a few years. There are statutes of limitations on complaints. And there are these things called law enforcement officers' bills of rights, which I find incredibly perverse. The only bill of rights that's meaningful belongs to citizens in America. But a result of this is that it's often extremely difficult to discipline bad officers. And if officers fired for misconduct, I think nationally 25% are later rehired, and more go to new departments or just transfer departments. And there's another study that actually found that after Florida sheriff's offices unionized, violent incidents surged by about 40%. So one perspective on trust is we certainly need to hold bad cops accountable. And in order to ensure that the reputation of police departments remains intact, and people view the policing or law enforcement as a legitimate institution, we have to do something to combat poor disciplinary procedures after police brutality. I think generally police brutality receives vastly more media attention than crime itself, which is kind of strange, but it is what it is. And I think that is one way to restore trust in police as an institution. But I think the other is quite simply just better law enforcement, or law enforcement where law enforcement seems to be absent, as in California, which is where I happen to be at the moment. So I would say those as two examples. Maybe one other is transparency. So data transparency. There's often no transparency into police use of force, even at a departmental level. You probably wouldn't want to have it at the individual level, because then you would have people picketing officers' homes and that sort of thing. But at least at the departmental level, we should have access to that sort of data. And I think that there's a place for the federal government to use to create conditionality on federal government grants to police departments to obtain that kind of data, in addition to the kind of national victimhood statistics, crime victim statistics. So I would say those is maybe 3 ways.
Yeah, there's two threads from what you just described, Clay, that I'd love to pull on, and we do have another question which I'll get to after that. The 2 threads are, one, this point about police unions. It's so interesting, obviously, that the police unions are the one a public sector union that Republicans really solicit the endorsements of, shall we say, the support of. And it's the one public sector union that people on the left, who are the champions of public sector unions, are willing to increasingly willing to scrutinize. That's been interesting. Have we seen, and this is a question for really anyone who has thought on this, have we seen any results from it? I know there have been a couple of efforts at reforming police unions or some of the rules that protect police unions. I know, Jonathan, you've done some work on this, qualified immunity and things like that. And then the second question I'd love to ask to whoever doesn't take that one is, we sort of, in a sense, obliquely talked about the issue of race and racial disparity as it relates to criminal justice reform. You touched on a little bit, Clay, and I think you did as well, Vikrant, talking about the new Jim Crow. To what degree is the debate about criminal justice reform excessively inflammatory because of the degree to which it has had a racial dimension? How much is the racial politics of criminal justice reform making it harder or easier to make progress on that issue? So let's start with the public sector one union first, whoever wants to do that, and then go to the race issue.
With the 18,000 police departments and, like, as you said, 700,000 officers, the unions can be a very massive impediment to police reform, to police accountability, and the laws that he was talking about absolutely need to be stricken. I have seen certain municipalities move towards and I certainly support this, the collective bargaining, making it public and having public impact, having public access to those negotiations, because they're often done in secret. They're hammered out. They're not really, the public doesn't get any access to it. And so the police are building their own protections without any sort of public input. And, we as the public are their bosses, right? And so we should be able to have some sort of say in this. And other places have tried to roll back protections, like in California, as I'm sure Clay is aware, and recently New York State with repeal of 50A, where the personnel documents have been locked away. And even California was so bad, like prosecutors had to go in camera to get this, even for their own benefit.
What was 50A in New York? Just to explain.
50A was a law that made it illegal to, you couldn't tell a police officer's disciplinary file is sealed from the public record. So unless he was arrested or something like that, if there was a complaint, even if it's a sustained, we don't know that officer's name. And so that law was repealed. So now when an officer is found guilty of some disciplinary action, it is now a part of the public record. Because it was the point where there was an officer, when I testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights several years ago, I found the study that showed that there was one officer, most officers in New York City had no complaints against them. A small percentage had one, smaller percentage had two. One officer had 50 complaints lodged against him, and we didn't know his name. And that's just like this perverse incidence of these laws. And it shows that there is, among the most problematic officers in any large department, it's probably no more than 10%, unless it's like a really bad department. You're talking about 5% of the population, but that the union protections are protecting those 5% more than everyone else. And it leads to the perverse incentives where the worst cops get protected and they keep their jobs. And it's absolutely, and it's just basically a matter of time until something happens. Very much like George Floyd, that officer should have been fired many years ago. And so it's when you just allow these, the bad apples, I don't really like the metaphor, but it's something that people latch on to. When you let the bad apple stay, it does in fact, ruin the whole bunch. And getting rid of those union protections is absolutely essential.
I agree with everything. I agree with everything Jonathan and Clay have said. I'll just, add one small point, which is that what I'm told you see sometimes is a weird situation where the unions will go before the city and they'll ask for more money, which is what unions ask for. And the response they'll get is, well, we're not going to pay you more money, but here's what we can give you. And they'll start negotiating over discipline in this way. That's a really bad trade-off. And things like discipline probably just need to be taken out of the collective bargaining process altogether. Those are not things that should be subject to negotiation and placed up against your income.
Great. All right, well, let's get to this question from the audience. How significant of an impact do you think unemployment, low wages, lack of economic opportunities have on crime levels?
That's a complicated question. We have these images from literature of Oliver Twist or Aladdin or whatever, people who live in desperate poverty and they go and pick pockets and steal, and your desperation causes crime to go up. And it seems to make intuitive sense to me. I feel like if I were poor, I think I would be more likely to steal. And yet, it's very difficult to establish a strong correlation. During the Great Depression, crime rates actually went down. After 2008, incidentally, that's probably a more pertinent example. Crime rates have been going down for a really long time, from about the mid-90s. And in 2008, there was this awful economic collapse that everybody remembers. And a lot of people started warning. They were saying, look, you're going to start to see crime rates finally start to tick up again because people are in trouble here. That didn't happen. Crime rates continued to go down in 08 and 09 and every year after, up until about 2015, when there was a very small uptick. So it's hard to establish that connection. It's just a really tricky thing to understand what causes crime to go up and what causes crime to go down. And I'm not familiar with any criminologist who's got a really solid theory of it. I don't know what Clay and Jonathan think, though.
The best thing I've read was Patrick Sharkey's Uneasy Peace, and he just basically talked about the myriad issues that led to the great crime decline that we've seen since the 1990s, but it doesn't really get into why crime goes up. It's sort of like when we were talking a little bit earlier about legitimacy and public trust. We know how police violate the trust, but we don't really know how to build it. I mean, we know there are tactics you can use, but like in a measurable sense. And so it's just one of these things where we're kind of arguing against the ether and these theories, but certainly all those things probably make it easier, but it's not necessarily, most people who are poor don't commit crimes, right? So it's not it can't be a singular variable. But certainly if you are poor and you have low access to education and you don't have access to mental health services you need, and you can have some sort of break or something along those lines, that is again going to make that more likely. And the more contact and the earlier contact you have with law enforcement in your life, the more likely you are to be incarcerated later on. So but yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer there.
Let me ask the racial disparities question this way. So the emotion around criminal justice reform, the protests with Black Lives Matter, centers around this, the perception that there is a racial disparity in the application of police force in the criminal justice system. The counter argument to that, or the argument you hear from the other side of the point of view or the debate is that no, that's not true. That in fact, if you study the incidents of police encounters, the incidents of police shootings or use of force, it correlates roughly to where criminal activity or police activity is happening. Who's got a thought on that particular topic in terms of is there a disparity in policing and criminal justice? And if so, what is it? And what is it that some of these counter arguments don't capture accurately?
I think it absolutely does exist. We have the numbers to show it. I mean, if you do, traffic stops, if you do pedestrian stops, it always skews towards Black and Latino people, and in certain areas, Native American, near reservations. It's there. The police will tell you that the reason why they're doing it is because that's where the crime is happening, or that's, they fit descriptions or something along those lines. And that's fine to an extent, except when it's deployed as policy that like we're going to ride around a black neighborhood and we're going to pull over a lot of people. That doesn't generally happen in posh white neighborhoods, right? So you actually have a situation where you have white people are policed differently from black people. And while there may be a difference in the criminal behaviors and all that, you're still looking for a needle in a haystack, right? You know, when 90% of the people that were stopped at the height of stop and frisk were completely innocent of anything, and only 8,000 guns were found in 4 million stops, which is hit rate of 0.2%, which was touted by Bloomberg in particular as an anti-gun measure, you're catching a lot more innocent people than you are catching guilty people, right? So you're basically criminalizing, or to the perspective of someone who has to go through that, is I'm being targeted because I'm black. It may be because my neighborhood, the officer doing it may be black. The officer in charge that told him to go pull people over may be black. It's not that it's, you know, we don't like black people and therefore we are weaponizing the state against them. But the tactics that they use can feel oppressive when they're being stopped, you know, just going about their lives. You know, the idea of liberty and security about going about your life is part of the liberty that we enjoy as Americans. And in certain neighborhoods in this country, being young, particularly being a young black man, you just experience liberty in an entirely different way. And I think it's really hard to connect that, because when white people tend to have interactions with police, it tends to be better. It's like they got stopped because they were definitely speeding, or someone broke into their house and their police came to help. But that's not necessarily how everyone experiences police. And I don't think a lot of Americans understand that people experience the police differently.
In a sense, what you're basically saying, if I can boil down the argument, it's that it may be that a preemptive policy like stop and frisk does catch criminals in the act, but there are a much larger number of people who are innocent who get approached or stopped or even hassled by the police, and that sows the mistrust that we were talking about earlier that leads to a breakdown of police community relations. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's you know, you feel like you're being treated like a criminal, and people tend to resent that. And I think police departments, don't take that social cost into account as much as they should.
So what's the solution to that then? What's the right way for police to police those neighborhoods where a lot of crime is happening? Because what you hear from urban leaders and people who are spokesmen in those communities, spokeswomen in those communities, they say, we have two problems at once. We're being under-policed and over-policed at the same time. The actual crime is not being prevented, but innocent people are dealing with this use of force.
Right. So what you can do is you can beef up patrols, but not ask them to do the invasive policing structures that, the behaviors that tick people off. Right. So if you're much less likely to commit a crime if you see a black and white down the street, right? We've got data to show this. Visible police presence makes a difference. It doesn't have to be invasive. But because police officers are often measured on arrests or stops or contacts or whatever, we've incentivized them to do the things that actually get in their way. If the sort of broken window style policing that was brought up earlier, that Clay mentioned, that, if it's in a zero tolerance environment, that actually takes police officers off the street. Because if you're taking someone off the street, if you're arresting someone for, say, public drinking or drug use, that officer has to go back and process that individual, which means he is no longer a visible presence on the street, and therefore he's no longer deterring crime. So that's actually harming both the community, and what is the public benefit of arresting a guy that you're going to release again tomorrow for this? Nothing. So it's a matter of trying to figure out what priorities that we're trying to do, what we're actually trying, that public safety and the security of the people who live in these neighborhoods is actually respected and protected, rather than, oh, we need to get these benchmarks by say getting a bunch of guns off the street or making a certain amount of drug arrests, because that shows that we're doing something, and that's what the community leaders ask for.
I mean, in a sense, what I'm taking away from this conversation is the point that, Clay, you started with, which is that if you want to have a unifying agenda around criminal justice reform, it's absolutely essential for it to be pragmatic philosophically, rather than, in fact, libertarian in philosophy. It can't, in a sense, start from police force is bad and we must be opposed to that. It has to come from, if you want people to be safe, here's the right balance of protecting people's rights and also ensuring that the police can do their job.
Sure, I think that's a fair assessment, and I would add to that. I think people need to focus on the real data. I think there's a tendency to hyper sensationalize certain kinds of crime, of which police brutality is probably the number one. And when, like obviously there's crime occurring all over the country and at 2 orders of magnitude or 3 orders of magnitude or 4 greater than the amount of police brutality, especially police homicides that wind up taking place a year. And that number is, very, very small. For all the attention it gets, I think it's, it's something like 10 unarmed Black civilians a year are shot by police and another 60 or so non-Black civilians. We're talking about truly tiny numbers compared to the number of total homicides in the country a year. I mean, almost 8,000 Black people are murdered every year, and a roughly similar number of non-Black people. And so this is, in absolute terms, just totally different set of numbers than the numbers around police brutality, which seems to be what everyone's focusing on. So I think thinking seriously about the numbers and being as pragmatic as possible, realizing that rehabilitation is possible and there are ways of reducing crime that do not rely on the kind of like throw them in prison and throw away the key, tough on crime mentality of the 80s and 90s. And I think there are many good examples of states that are able to both reduce incarceration and also reduce crime rates. Texas was actually the first among these, Texas under Rick Perry, which some on the left might find strange. But I think the other thing is, I think we need to be realistic about the statistics on racial injustice, which is undoubtedly real. I find it appalling that many on the right are swift to just sort of deny that racial injustice exists in the criminal justice system and deny the basic reality that the sort of Black Lives Matter movement is responding to. And I mean, there's all sorts of statistics on this. I mean, we still have the crack and cocaine sentencing disparities. We still have, like, with wrongful convictions and exonerations, minorities account for about half of those. When you look at the way that the death penalty is imposed, it's almost unquestionably racialized. And if you look at especially executions for rape in America, this one was one of the most staggering for me. It's between 1930 and 72, 89% of the people executed for rape in America were Black men convicted of raping white women, even though Black women were far more likely to be victims of sexual assault. So I think there are all these ground realities that the right is sort of unwilling to countenance and points to discrepancies in racial crime rates as an explanation for discrepancies in policing and law enforcement. But the numbers don't quite match. And I think it's important to be as realistic about data as possible, and then also to favor solutions that both sides can agree on. I think there's lots in this category. Police unions and kind of transparency around use of force reporting data are two on the law enforcement side, but there's also tons you can do in probation and parole to improve the way that those organizations function. And so that's what we're doing. We have lobbyists in 7 or 8 states next year. We're going to push every single one of these reforms in those states. And we'll do it with bipartisan coalitions because this is the moment. I mean, it's sort of a pop policy issue right now. And I think it is very possible to bridge the gap between the two sides and pass good reform in a bipartisan, pragmatic way. So I think it's imminently possible and we should do it.
We're at 4:30, but we have 2 questions that I'd love to get to if everyone can stick around. The first is from Barbara Williams, who asked the question about the new Jim Crow. I think it was you, Vikrant, who mentioned the new Jim Crow. Maybe it was Jonathan. One of you two did. Is there not an inherited culture that needs to be considered that comes out of the legacy of slavery and segregation? To what degree, in your research or expertise, is the legacy of slavery and segregation a part of the way policing is done in the United States?
I mean, I think for those who don't know, my father was a police officer, and my father was Black. He was a Black police officer in Indiana from 1958 to 1978. He was a conservative, but he was what they would call at the time a race man. Like he understood that, there was, obviously during that time, you couldn't deny that there were racial imbalances and unfairness in the country. And he would certainly balk at the idea that he was being part of like the slaveocracy or a legacy of that. However, if you look at it, pretty much every major American city, north and south, but particularly in the north, actually, you see that our cities are racially divided, and they are in fact policed differently, and Black neighborhoods are policed more harshly and more aggressively. And yet they're not, these aggressive policing tactics aren't necessarily driving down crime. If anything, they seem to negatively correlate in certain respects. But so yes, I think that there is the racialism, the racialized issue is absolutely real, but I think too many people get caught up in intent, like, oh well, cops came from slave catchers and therefore they can't be reformed and they need to be abolished, which I don't buy into. Very few people, I think, go into the police force looking that we're trying to oppress people. Most people try to go in because they're trying to help them. But the systems that we've done, that we tolerate certain abuses or certain tactics that can alienate people. And if you're doing that to only one group of people, like here in DC, there was just a report that showed the gun recovery unit only used force against Black people in the city, even though we know other people in the city carry guns. Like that sort of thing is unacceptable. And so you can't deny that it exists, but the question is, how do we go about fixing it, right? And so I think, unfortunately, too many people, particularly on the left, want to assign intent and a negative intent on the part of police and those institutions, which, yes, that there are problems there, but it's not that they're doing it with malice. And I think it's very easy to conflate the two between this is how we've done things, and that has a legacy related to segregation, but it's not necessarily like we are doing this as a matter of oppression.
Can I just ask, I mean, this goes to any of you, I don't know what the exact number is, but let's say the top 100 large cities in America are run by Democrats, almost all of them. Democrats think of themselves as being for criminal justice reform, for racial equality. How to explain that? The fact that these incidents are happening in democratically run cities.
I mean, well, because I think, depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers here. But to me, it just seems to me that the police have been so insulated from the democratic control through the unions, through the legislative protections they've been getting at the state level, that they are responding to the political needs, which is like, oh, crime rate went up. Okay, what do you do? Well, we turned in a bunch of guns. And so it's about being that sort of technocratic effectiveness issue that I think that urban Democrats are going to latch on, whereas they will talk a good game. And the thing is, police leadership will talk a good game about community policing, and that we're going to try and do the right thing, and we want to engage with the community, but then they still send out jump out cars and units that terrorize these communities at the same time. I think there's just this massive gap between what they say and what they actually ask the police to do, and I don't think that a lot of times people understand how those are related, and how you can't just say, well, we believe in racial equality and we're going to try and reduce crime, reduce racial profiling, and then not actually change any policy to do it. And so some places have started counting, and they're like, oh, well, yes, it looks like our state police are pulling over too many Black people, or many more Black people than white people. And they produce 10 years of reports and they never change any policy about it. So I think too often it's been, we're going to pay lip service to this, but then actually not do anything about it.
I'm going to tell a quick public policy story that merges a lot of threads here. So Jonathan's points about, people having good intentions, but nevertheless, there being a legacy of slavery and segregation that influences the way we do things. Your question about cities, here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about school zone laws. So these are laws that were passed in a lot of places a few decades ago, in which people, all of whom were well-meaning, would say, okay, drugs and drug selling is bad, but where it's really bad is when you start doing it to children. So what we want to do is make sure that this stuff isn't happening near schools. So we're going to enhance the penalty and make sure that anybody who is selling drugs to children within X feet of a school, their penalty is doubled, or whatever it may be. So This is a law that is applied neutrally. It's nobody means anything, it means no malice by it. A lot of conservatives wanted to pass these laws because they were concerned about kids. A lot of Black Americans, by the way, and Black legislators wanted to pass these laws because they were concerned about the things that they were seeing in their neighborhood, particularly around the time of the crack epidemic. But here's how they get applied in practice. If you grow up in a very suburban, bucolic place like I did, Fort Worth, Texas, what exists around your high school is just football fields, baseball diamonds, soccer fields, tennis courts, things like that. Nobody is selling drugs right in the middle of the 50-yard line. That's not how that works. If, however, you go to school in a dense urban area, say you're in New York or Chicago or Baltimore, right across the street from the school, apartment complexes, laundromats, the 7-Eleven, just where people live their lives, all sorts of transactions of every sort are taking place. So the people who live in the cities are going to get swept up with the penalty enhancement a lot more than the people who live in the suburbs. And we know that African Americans disproportionately tend to be concentrated in cities. And so you end up sweeping in all of these African Americans who end up doing a lot more prison time than the suburban kids like me. And nobody meant it to happen that way. But that was the consequence. And that's just that's a legacy of living patterns and demographic patterns in the country that are connected to segregation and slavery. Those are the kinds of things we have to be thinking a lot more about on the front end whenever we write our laws.
That's a great point, Vikrant. Well, I'm going to close with this comment from our friend, Governor Allen, who says that he is no longer a Redskins fan, now a Raiders fan, and he admires Jerry Jones, and wants you to know, Vikrant, that he completely agrees with your observation that disciplinary issues should be completely separate from compensation negotiations in places that allow for collective bargaining for government employees. With that, I've kept everyone a little long. I appreciate your forbearance in letting me do this. It's an important topic. I want to thank Vikrant, Clay, and Jonathan for joining us. Governor Allen, maybe we'll have to have you on one of these someday. Appreciate your guest starring for us. Stay tuned for the rest of the week. We're going to be here at the same time, 3:30 Eastern, tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. You can check out the whole schedule at agenda.freopp.org, and the URL that you use to join into this session will also work for those. I'm Avik Roy, President of FREOPP. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Avik.
Thanks so much.
All right.